Welcome to Writer's Corner. My name is Joe Viglione from Visual Radio. Very honored to have Mark Griffin here. 100 or more hidden things, the life and films of Vincente Minnelli. How do you even begin a book on a man whose life is so deep?
Luckily, my obsession started when I was very young. In the days before the advent of the VCR, I used to beg my parents to stay up to watch The Late Show, which for those under 30 was this late night broadcast of bad prints of great movies. And my obsession developed when I was maybe like 8 or 9, and our local public broadcasting station probably owned an MGM film package. And I started to notice that a lot of these musicals starring the likes of Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly and Judy Garland were largely directed by one individual, and that of course was Mr. Minnelli. And my obsession launched immediately, and I said, I have to know everything there is to know about this enigmatic guy, because at that time there was virtually nothing available about him. In 1974 he had published his own autobiography, but even as a kid I got the sense that it was very polite and diplomatic, and you definitely got a sense that he wasn't really sharing the whole story. So it made me all the more curious, to know everything that I could about him. And where did all these iconic images come from? Judy Garland performing the Trolley Song, or Gene Kelly in An American in Paris ballet. And there it all reverts back to one person, Vincent Minnelli, and yet we know so little about him. So I said, he's definitely ripe for his own life story to be fully explored. So, from all those screenings on The Late Show, and after years of research, and I think it was 124 interviews or something.
Whoa.
Yeah, here's the result. We finally get to train the spotlight on Vincent instead of one of his legendary stars for a change.
One of my guests, C. David Heyman, wrote the Bobby and Jackie book, Bobby Kennedy, Jackie Onassis. He did all these interviews and put them at State University in New York. So you can go hear his interviews. Have you put yours out to the public, or do you keep everything within the context of the book?
I'm hoping eventually the Minnelli archives are actually in Beverly Hills at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, Margaret Herrick Library, and they're voluminous. I mean, you could spend probably years looking at all of the production files and letters and memos that Minnelli kept. So I'm hoping that eventually some of these interviews that I did with the likes of Lauren Bacall or Kirk Douglas or Angela Lansbury will find their way into an archive like that, so that future generations who are curious about the same production details that I were can listen to some of these fascinating interviews and find out what it was like to be on the set of Lust for Life with Kirk Douglas playing Vincent van Gogh, directed by Minnelli, and it's just fascinating to hear the firsthand accounts of what something like that was all about.
These great actors and actresses, Angela Lansbury, they must have had so many different directors. Did you get a sense that they were very excited or happy that you were going to re-explore this man's life?
I think very much so, because let's face it, nowadays vintage film, or some people impolitely say old movies, don't get the same press that they used to. And I think there's a whole generation that, unfortunately, even with the DVDs and Blu-ray and TCM and everything that's going on, the next generation hasn't really been completely introduced to all of these magnificent productions that came from MGM and Paramount in the 40s and 50s. And I think it's definitely time that we explore a lot of this and bring it back to light, as it were.
Now, how long have you been in Maine?
On and off for years. I was born in Lewiston, Maine, and I was never sports oriented. I was never a hockey fan, and in Lewiston, Maine, in the winter particularly, if you're not a sports enthusiast, then you find yourself, inside at midnight when you're 8 or 9 years old, staring at a Zenith television set and wanting to be part of the Minnelli universe, wanting to be romping around some tropical paradise with Gene Kelly and Judy Garland. So.
And my question was, because you're in Maine where it's nice and quiet sometimes to write, but this is based in Hollywood.
Correct.
Did you have to go quite a few times?
Yeah, in terms of the research, I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles and looked at the Minnelli archives at the Academy, and then Minnelli was part of the Freed unit at MGM, which was the legendary unit that produced all of these great musicals like Meet Me in St. Louis and Gigi and An American in Paris. So the Arthur Freed papers were all at the University of Southern California, and then there were other materials that I needed to see at UCLA. And I spent a lot of time in New York City because even before Minnelli got to Hollywood, there was a whole career on Broadway. He was a designer and director at Radio City Music Hall. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of legwork that needed to be done. And there had been other, monographs and papers about Minnelli, but nobody had really gone out and taken the time to interview as many of his surviving collaborators as possible. And I thought that that's really an integral and important part of the story that no one's gone after. So I definitely made that one of my primary missions with this project was I need to talk to everyone that I can get my hands on.
Now, I don't want your secret sauce, but whatever you can tell us, because I'm thinking all this material, do you take pictures and email them to yourself, or do you just walk away with tons of different, copies of things? Because then your table is just full of
Exactly. My basement
folklore.
Yeah. My basement office at home, for the most part, I'm a pretty neat and organized person, but during the writing of this book, it looked like some kind of library or museum that had exploded, because there was just endless paperwork and research materials spread out in stacks of books. And I'm one of these people that likes to be really as scrupulous and meticulous as possible. And I felt that to do a project about a perfectionist like Vincent Minnelli, and to sort of really pay tribute to him correctly, you had to work the same way that he did, which is to say really painstakingly and take the time to be obsessive about details. So I guess the short answer is yes, my house was a mess the whole time I was writing this, yeah.
As I tell my authors, I read the books on the treadmill, and it's very thick and rich with information, and I have so many interviews to do, so I'm trying to catch up. I didn't get the whole book in. What I do love about the book, the photos. You've got them scattered throughout, and people don't do that anymore.
Right.
This is a very special thing about this book. The photos are everywhere, and I love that. And you can feel the texture of the old movies, as you said, the really refined film, I'll call them. There's a really excellent texture to some of these films that you don't see today.
Right.
Maybe because of digital, maybe because everything's big. But there's a texture to these films that's very warm.
Right. And if you think about a movie like Meet Me in St. Louis, which is, that was one of Vincent's first critically acclaimed hits, it's so sumptuously produced, and you can just see all of the care and the attention that was lavished on a movie like that, and the layering. And it's the kind of thing that we don't see that much anymore because it's all been replaced by robots and digital technology, and so you're kind of losing a lot of the human factors. And just to think when they were making a movie like that in the 1940s or even in the 50s, they didn't have the same technical resources that we have now. The Wizard of Oz, for example, when, that's not a Minnelli film, but it was produced by Arthur Freed, they had to create all of those special effects from scratch. So in a strange way, it's much more impressive that what they had to go through back then to get a film made than today.
Well, it's kind of like the Rolling Stones have the Exile on Main Street classic album being re-released next month with 10 bonus tracks. And I heard that Don Was did the remix, and it's like, he's a great producer, but he shouldn't be touching this masterpiece that Jimmy Miller did in a basement in the south of France,
Exactly.
Which it was done layered. Tumbling Dice is layered, just like those films. These are the great masters. And even though it was the 70s, it's like the 40s, 50s. It's the vintage era of the Rolling Stones. It shouldn't be touched. I see this picture on page 172.
From Brigadoon.
Now, does the director get this out of the actors, or does he just put everything into play? Did Minnelli have that kind of effect on people that he could get them to just the still picture itself just sings?
Says so much, right? Just the visual image. And Minnelli was definitely a director who was sort of pictorially fixated. He started as a window dresser and a photographer's assistant, then he was a designer. So he brought all of that training and experience to Hollywood. So when you look at a film like Gigi, which is one of his masterpieces, it won the Oscar in 1958, You can just see that this is someone who wasn't just handed a script and filmed it. You know, Vincent really took his time, and a lot of the actors told me great stories about waiting around for him as he's, you know, rearranging the table centerpieces or the curtains to get them just so. And he treated all of those furnishings and trappings as though they were important supporting characters in the film. You know, he might be keeping an actor like Lauren Bacall or Kirk Douglas waiting while he's kind of fiddling with the palm trees and the floral centerpieces, because he knew that even, you know, sort of peripheral elements that other directors wouldn't pay attention to that way, that everything has an importance. And the title, again, 100 or More Hidden Things, you know, that's a direct quote from Minnelli. He was talking about all of the subliminal elements that went into the creating of Meet Me in St. Louis. But it's also interesting that that same kind of layering is also applicable to his personal life. You know, there was just so many things happening beneath the surface and behind the films.
And you get into that in the book.
We do, yes. You know, had long been questions and rumors about Minnelli's ambiguous sexuality. My original editor on this project said, well, I really need you to go out and get the definitive answer to this. You know, for years, it was the was he or wasn't he argument, the kind of thing that, you know, also followed James Dean or Cary Grant around for years. And so he said, I really need you to do as much research as possible and try to come back with a yes or no. And of course, as we know in life, and particularly in matters of sexuality, oftentimes things don't fall into an A or B category. It's just not that simple. And in Minnelli's case, you know, I heard a wide-ranging collection of opinions about that, just as I did about what he was like as a director. You know, some people, like Margaret O'Brien, who's in Meet Me in St. Louis, adored him and said, you know, he was soft-spoken and quiet, but he was in charge in a very, definitely in charge, despite the fact that he was kind of subdued. And then other people found him very exasperating, like Ellen Burstyn was in his 1964 comedy Goodbye Charlie, and she absolutely loathed working on that film, even though she's a great actress. And she said Minnelli, you know, had this idiosyncratic habit of reciting the lines along with the actors, and he was trying to get them to sort of mimic his own interpretation of the character. And a lot of people found that to be like micromanaging, and they just couldn't stand it. So a lot of complexities and a lot of contradictions, and it makes, luckily, I mean, as a subject to write a book about, Vincent Minnelli was endlessly fascinating because he is so multifaceted and has all of these contradictions going on.
Many great geniuses are like that. Alfred Hitchcock.
Correct, right.
The more compelling their films are, it seems, the more complex the character behind those films.
That's true. And Minnelli's dream project for a long time was to do a film biography of Vincent van Gogh, which was one of his idols. And he got the opportunity to do that with Kirk Douglas playing Van Gogh in Lust for Life. And it's really interesting that, you know, Vincent van Gogh was certainly not an easy dude to deal with either. And I think Minnelli saw a lot of himself in Van Gogh, and that was one of the reasons he was so attracted to that project.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So he had a bit of a mentor, maybe.
I think so. And that was Minnelli's original aim, was to be a visual artist. So very often you see, like in An American in Paris, the climactic ballet with Gene Kelly and Leslie Caron is an homage to the Impressionist painters like Monet and Dufay. And then, for example, Meet Me in St. Louis is a tribute to Thomas Eakins. So this was the kind of, you know, very meticulous layering that Minnelli would do. And, you know, also layered the film with many little subtle flourishes that if you just do a quick reading of the film, it might be too subtle to get. But if you really pay attention and do the work, then I think you'll be rewarded, certainly, because it's all there.
You know, I saw the photo here of the Van Gogh, the fellow painting Van Gogh. And you think those paintings become worth so much money, but a film goes to DVD and you can pick them up for very short money. Do people appreciate the art when they can buy it so inexpensively?
I hope so, because Minnelli's cinematic legacy is, in a sense, it's really priceless. I mean, he gave so much of himself to his work that when you can buy An American in Paris DVD for $14.95, one hopes that, you know, you're really appreciating the enormous bargain that you're getting, you know, because that film was so such a painstaking effort, as all of his productions were. So, you know, I certainly hope that the viewer who's watching these now will have the same sort of appreciation, maybe even deeper, because these films have certainly stood the test of time, and they've endured so many changing tastes, and he made so many films that are timeless that it's fantastic that they're still around today and on the video store shelves.
It seems the audience today needs a little extra, the bonus thing. Someone like you, the biographer, maybe talking about these films, maybe in a series. That would be something for people who would get a perspective. You've studied them.
Right.
I've studied the Rolling Stones. My perspective is valuable. Your perspective is valuable because we have the obsession gives you a glimpse into the genius.
Right.
And if you're not obsessed, you can't really fathom the genius.
Yeah, and I think it's important to channel the obsession in a really proactive and creative way. Like, don't let it overtake you, but use it some way to share your enthusiasm and maybe your education with others so that they can maybe derive the same kind of benefits from it that you have.
And I said obsession with a very respectful tone.
Oh, absolutely.
Because without passions over a subject matter, we wouldn't have 100 or more hidden things. You have a blog.
I do.
How do you get to the blog?
I'm the least tech-savvy person that you'll ever meet, but I want to say that the blog address is www.100ormorehiddenthings.blogspot.com.
.blogspot.com.
Thank you.
It came up on the front page of Google, which was good because when I put your name and Minnelli in, I put your name and then Minnelli. I didn't put his full name. I just put Mark Griffin and then Minnelli. 74,000 items came up.
Wow, that's good to know.
Yeah. So you look at that. You can put just Mark Griffin. You can put Vincente Minnelli in. But when I put Mark Griffin, Minnelli, I got the I got your book talk, Mark Griffin and the Life and the Art of Director Minnelli, and I went to Wikipedia, of course, because you're writing a book now in the Wikipedia age. You really can't trust this site, but there's a lot of good stuff in Wikipedia, despite some of the non-writers that are adding their thoughts. You have to just be aware there's great stuff and then there's not so great stuff.
True, and I think it's important to treat something like Wikipedia as maybe a study aid. It isn't the whole course, but it's giving you kind of maybe a brief and hopefully accurate overview of whatever subject you've typed in. So if someone, looks at the Wikipedia entry for Vincent Minnelli, hopefully, it will give you some sense about what he was like, but then inspire you to buy 100 or more hidden things or get it out of the library and really learn the whole complete story, and find out what they don't have time to cover on the internet.
Now, with his autobiography, reading that and then reading your book, are they good companion books, do you think?
Well, the thing is, as much as I revere and idolize Mr. Minnelli, that autobiography from 1974 is sort of ironically titled, I Remember It Well. And when I really got into the research, I found out that he didn't remember it well. And there were so many important elements that he left out of his own story. It was almost like he was carefully self-editing. For example, he had a developmentally disabled brother named Paul, whom he never publicly acknowledged in later years. And he had a beloved Uncle Frank who killed himself around the time that Vincent graduated from high school. And then, of course, going back to the conflicted sexuality, there was also a boyfriend named Lester Gaba, whom Minnelli apparently met in Chicago. And then the two of them lived together there and then also in New York City. And all of these elements were left out of the autobiography. So there was a lot of self-censorship going on. So I would say if you read that book, you can read it with pleasure, but then also read it with caution, because it is someone who's kind of being very politically correct in telling their own story. So I think if you want, a more hopefully well-rounded portrait, then you might want to definitely take a peek at 100 or more hidden things, because I really tried to, examine all of the aspects of his life story in connection to all of these magnificent films, and show how maybe the films were mirroring the life, and how a lot of these movies were sort of poignant autobiographies in code, as it were. So, yeah, with Mr. Minnelli's autobiography, I would say definitely give it a glance, because there's some important information in there, and it's his, version of events. But then I think you also have to look beyond that as well.
And when you say boyfriend, I guess you confirmed what your editor was asking.
Right. It's interesting because so many decades have flown by that we can't go back in time and, a lot of the people that I would have loved to have interviewed by the time I launched this project in 2006, unfortunately, were no longer with us. But I really tried to make a concerted effort to talk to as many people as I could get to. And I heard a really wide-ranging collection of opinions about what people thought about the sort of sensitive topic of Minnelli's sexuality. So I had people who were saying it was definitely A, and then I had other people who were saying, no, it was definitely B. And to sort of, it was just interesting from a narrative point of view to include the contradictions. Because when you have someone who's emphatically saying it was this way, and then the next interview subject is saying, no, it was really this, I think that maybe there isn't a definitive answer, and it's more complex, or it falls into a gray area. So just to offer the reader all points of view and all perspectives is really interesting and compelling, rather than me, taking a position and saying it was definitely this. Because at this point, I can't be inside the man's psyche. I can only make educated guesses. But I think we can definitely say he was living in a different era under a lot of societal pressures. So if he had homosexual leanings, then he was living in a period of time when that wasn't as socially acceptable as it would be today.
Although James Whale is well known, and was a famous director of Bride of Frankenstein, of course, and there was a film about his life. What I find interesting is after these people pass on, sure, we're in a new millennium, and it is still difficult for people of all persuasions or ethnicities. There's always some kind of discrimination somewhere. No matter who you are, you can be a white male and straight and still have discrimination somewhere.
Right.
Somewhere in the world. But when Raymond Burr died, and Barbara Hale, his co-star, kept saying he's not gay. It's like, well, he lived with Robert Benavides for 34 years. Everyone knows. I mean, how can she, with a straight face? Because I love Barbara Hale, but it's so absurd for her to go on TV and just be so defensive about him, and he's gone.
Right.
So with Vincente, I bring it up because with Vincente Minnelli. That's the correct pronunciation, Vincente?
I've actually heard it both ways, but I heard an audio recording of Judy Garland from the 60s, and she referred to him as Vincent. So I would say that that's probably the correct pronunciation.
Vincent.
Yeah.
Okay.
And his real name, of course, was Lester, and he changed his name to Vincent to sound more sophisticated and chic. And
Oh, I thought it was for Van Gogh.
oh, you would think. And they also spelled that differently. He's Vincent with an E. Van Gogh is Vincent with just the T on the end. So.
Well, yeah, you have, the artiste.
Right. It has to say man of the world and aesthete and,
What a nice, great ring for Liza to have. Liza Minnelli is it rolls off your tongue.
It certainly does. It's marquee ready, isn't it?
Yeah, it's got two Lees in there. Lisa, Minnelli.
Yeah.
So it's redundant in a good way. So she it's better than Liza Garland.
Yes, and Kander and Ebb wrote her that great song from the 70s, Liza with a Z. Not Lisa with an S, Liza with a Z.
Yeah. Well, I think that was the special I was talking to you about. It was magnificent to see it on DVD. And that's bonus tracks, to have a guy like you talking over the movie after you see the movie in its original print. And then you have an expert talking over it. It's so important for the fans. And I think that will bring more of that cachet, that, like respect for the movies, the way that we have respect for Van Gogh painting.
Right.
If you have this added, someone giving you the direction, because people just don't have the time to even investigate a movie, let alone watch it 4 or 5 times. They need an expert to kind of give them the cliff notes, and then they can go back and appreciate it a lot more.
Right, and I think luckily in the last decade or so, or even more, Hollywood has really started to wise up to the fact that it needed to be more self-protective about its own product. Because like in the 1970s, there were horror stories that when a lot of the major studios, MGM is a good example, started to sell off this incredible collection of costumes and props and sheet music and production files, a lot of that just got tossed into dumpsters or, sold off the rack for
Awful.
Yeah, a Greta Garbo costume sold for $5, and they didn't.
And Sotheby's today.
Correct. It would bring in millions, and people just didn't have a sense of the real history of all of this, material. And I think finally now, and you see this in the bonus features with DVDs, for example, or Martin Scorsese talking about how much he loves Minnelli's movies, you're getting a better sense of people starting to be more educated and appreciative of the whole history.
Well, I'm not going to say the name, but a future guest of ours will be on very soon. was telling me that the record industry thought DAT tape was it, DAT, remember that? Mm-hmm. It's like the mini DVs we have, so they started putting the master tapes onto DAT and destroying the master tapes or dumping them.
Tragic.
Now, I've been in the recording business for 33 years. I've kept all my masters. Even the analogs, after we transfer them, I still keep them. You never know. Well, it turns out that the DAT tapes start going back to the tape at the top and the bottom, I guess. I might not be technically absolutely correct, but it's something like this. The tape starts reverting back to what it originally was. So you're losing information.
Right.
And all these precious masters are like, you can't go back with the technology of 10 years from now. I hope with the films, I know they're preserving a lot of them.
Right, and many of Minnelli's films have ended up on the National Film Registry.
Good.
Maybe in St. Louis and An American in Paris, so they're protected that way. And hopefully generations to come will have the benefit of seeing those films and enjoying them. So it's good that people are starting to get a lot more savvy about restoration and...
Essential.
Absolutely.
We only have a few minutes left, and there's so much I want to cover with you. Have you noticed, like, when George Lucas does another Star Wars and who's in Cameron, when he's doing the Avatar, they're adding all the stuff that you saw in King Kong. You're talking about layers. But they kind of do a lot of it. Mr. Minnelli was a lot more tasteful sometimes, and all due respect to those great directors. But he layered things in a more subtle way, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, and there's so much psychological and emotional layering going on in the movies. You know, for example, a movie like Gigi, it's about a young girl who's being groomed to be a courtesan or a well-groomed prostitute. And Minnelli slips in a lot of bird imagery in Gigi. If you pay close attention, in the background there's always like a bird painting, or there are swans floating by as Leslie Caron is singing a musical number. And basically what he's saying there is this is a protagonist who's going to fly against the flock. She's going to rebel and, you know, fly off on her own. And that's Minnelli being very intelligent and subtle and, you know, slipping a lot of that in kind of almost subversively. So I love the fact that I think of a Vincent Minnelli movie when it's at its best as a sumptuous gift package. You open the package, the elegant, you know, ribbons and the beautiful bow, and then underneath it you get, you know, even more treasures, you know, and you just keep going and going, because that's how, you know, exhaustively that he crafted these films. It's just really extraordinary.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Your great publicist, Lisa Warren's here, and
It's wonderful.
Dina from DeCapo.
Correct.
Now, you went on a tour. You saw our friend Ginny up in...
Yes, in Lawrence earlier.
Lawrence.
She was terrific as well.
Smokey Bacon. You had fun with Smokey and Dick.
The inimitable Smokey Bacon. Yes, my day started at the Park Plaza, and I got to be interviewed. And this has been neat because I've gone to New York City and introduced a Minnelli film at the Museum of Modern Art, and you know, did a little event at my local library in Lewiston, Maine. So it's wonderful. I mean, this book has taken me to some really remarkable places.
Well, this is the underground. I think that of public access is more of the underground than, say, college radio. I think we're an important community, and you got to meet a lot of the
principal
our colleagues.
Yeah.
So you know, I'm happy you did that, because I think people. It's kind of fun when you do the circuit, and then I'm sure all the interviews were different.
Very different. Yeah.
And that's good for you, you know.
Absolutely. You know, variety is the spice of life. So
100 or More Hidden Things: The Life and Films of Vincent Minnelli, Mark Griffin on DeCapo, and it's decapopress.com. And again, the blogspot.com, 101.
100 or More Hidden Things .blogspot.com. I hope I'm getting that correct.
Yeah, 100 or More Hidden Things.blogspot.com. I'll put Mark Griffin and Hidden Things and blog in Google.
Thank you.
It'll come right up. 74,000 items. You have to be a little specific, but it'll work. It's been a lot of fun having you here on Writer's Corner, and it'll rebroadcast on visual radio.
Terrific.
And you know, when you're back down here, if you're doing a film thing, you're always welcome in the studio.
Oh, thank you so much.
Chat more about this.
Yes, it's endlessly fascinating, so I'd be glad to.
Thanks so much, and thanks to Steve Gay and Jennifer Willey and Joe LaRocca, and again, thanks to you, Mark Griffin, for coming down here.
My pleasure, thank you.
Writer's Corner, and hello to our friends at Bookends and at the Winchester Library. All good people.